Hello everyone, we're going to be talking about Alfred today because Alfred is quite interesting, and I asked a lot of you on Twitter to tell me what you think about Alfred as a unit. And in this video we're going to investigate how true or how false those conceptions are. And to help me with that here is Septi. Hello Septi, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing pretty good. Yeah, I'm here.
I guess we'll just go over the tweets, and then Septi, experienced certified Alfred user, is going to help me figure out, how true are these tweets. Right? Maybe real quick, Septi, what is your experience with Alfred? What is your affinity with Alfred? Why are we defending him here?
Yeah, so I've obviously played quite a bit of this game. I think we all have at this point. And I've used Alfred a couple times, and I've seen a lot of people use him, and people tend to have this attitude that he's like one of the worst units in the game and that he's irredeemable, when in reality he's just actually pretty good. He's like fine. But people just really hate on him to an almost funny degree.
For sure. I'm among that group, by the way, or rather, when I started out playing the game, I did not have a good first impression of Alfred. You can hear it in some of my older videos. I can't believe they gave me Ford and then took away his swords and then got him doubled by every single enemy. I can't believe it.
In the game where weapon triangle is the best, they took away Ford's swords.
His only claim to fame. They also took away rescue dropping, which is the only other thing that Ford could do.
Yeah.
At least Ford didn't die that quickly, but Alfred gets like doubled by half the enemies, it felt like. This is probably like selective memory, but I don't remember Alfred performing very well in almost any battle that I used him in. And he was available for quite a lot of the early game. I had no way to replace him until I got to like chapter 7 or 8 or something. Alfred, I think, is the unit that most people were very disappointed on, and then he has like a couple of really ardent defenders who insist he's actually not that bad, which I can see. Personally, my experience with him wasn't very good. I was noticing he was getting doubled quite a bit more than I would have liked. Like, early on, he has some of the worst stats of the frontline units, and then he has like one more move, and the one more move just didn't feel like it was worth it. I still don't think he's very good, but I can see where the potential is. But before we get into all that, let me go into why people say Alfred is bad. I collected some tweets. I blurred out the names to make it a little less personal. So if you're in this, don't worry, it's not personal. We're just disagreeing on Fire Emblem units. That's all this is. In the future, if I do these videos again, I might leave the names in and have like a little warning about it. But because I didn't have a warning this time, I censored the names. So that's why you don't see those. Okay, so first one. Bravo, Intelligent Systems. You finally made an early game cav people won't overraid. Found him unusable. He's more workable now that with the well updates and finished DLC, but those resources can be used to get better units even further ahead rather than catching him up. I like him though. That A support with Saline hits different, but sadly he's a lower tier unit on Maddening. Really bad. His bases are some of the worst in the whole game. His growths are just okay, and his special class is pretty bad. There isn't anything you'd want to train him for, and the effort necessary to catch him up to the level of every other unit makes him a huge liability. He's the one unit you get before Brodia that doesn't feel like he has a purpose. He gets doubled in his recruitment chapter in Maddening, and only Etia is effectively slower, but she actually does damage. There's also little incentive to use him long term, as Chloe outclasses him. And then the last of the tweets that actually calls him like really bad. Pretty bad, and I couldn't make him work in the early game Maddening, and he died in like chapter 5. Now, of course, not a completely unbiased sample, because some of the tweets were a little bit more mild on Alfred. Some of them actually liked them. For example, I got some that I labeled Alfred OK. One saying, Alfred is living proof that speed is the most important stat in Engage, because his low speed alone prevents him from ever being higher than low B tier. Then we have, I've only played Maddening mode, and there he is a decent early game filler that requires a lot of investment to be used long term. Investment that is better off going to someone like Chloe or Saline. Then we have, Alfred's pretty decent, definitely usable in the early game and buffed from well access. Shouldn't be hard to get him some early game staples like Canter, and +3 speed is enough to fix, but not double his speed issues for the mid game. He's usable, just let down by his horrendous bases. Someone here, he's a good early game unit but falls off hard later on. His lackluster growths and more speed made me have to eventually bench him, especially since Amber was basically the same but better once I recruited him. Fairly weak, but easily fixable due to Engage's mechanics. He suffers from terrible speed and bad build in the early game, but with an emblem like Lynn or Ike, which you don't get for a while, he can easily outpace his weakness. Another one about Amber. Amber outclasses him in my case. He isn't terrible, but I felt like he was just outclassed by later units and fell out of favor to better units. This is one of my favorites. Clive Ford feeling. He's alright, but his low speed on maddening, bulky enemies made him hard to justify using. RNG proc skills in this game are kind of there, and I personally prefer consistency over randomness. I'm assuming this is referring to his class personal. He lives or he lives, but with more HP. Yeah, so like that. And then I have one tweet here. Someone who actually calls him good or even amazing. But even that has a caveat. A amazing early game unit did carry my Manding run in the beginning until chapter 12. Then he fell off because every other unit did something better than him. Still, would use him again, he gets too much hate in my opinion. Right, so the trends that I'm seeing is kind of a bad start for him. Low speed especially is a big problem apparently. Needs resources to get going. And not a whole lot of payoff. Bad personal class apparently. Some people don't like his noble class. I feel like it's basically a cavalier. And then he promotes into, I think it's called Avenir, which doesn't have a great selling point either. That's kind of what the vibe I'm getting. And the vibe I got too in my hard mode playthrough was like, well, pretty rocky start. Did get doubled early on before, you know, many other people had the opportunity to even get doubled. And I did eventually have to bench him because you get so many units that seem to have a better start. So, Septi, what are they missing here and what am I missing here?
The first thing that I think a lot of people are missing is, like, I'm seeing so much of people saying, oh, he gets doubled.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, I have to ask, like, what are people doing with him that leads to them getting doubled? And also, if you do get doubled, why is that actually a problem? Like, one of those tweets mentioned that he gets doubled in his join chapter, I think, which is technically true if he's weighed down by his Iron Lance. The sword fighters do have exactly enough AS to double him. But what unit do you have besides a Lear who could use Marth to, you know, just one-shot those guys or heal all the damage they take? No other unit you have in Chapter 3 is actually better equipped for dealing with sword fighters than Alfred, even though he gets doubled. So it's not like getting doubled is actually that big a deal. Clan, for example, takes 8 damage compared to Alfred, who takes 4 damage twice. It's the same thing, it's just better. So him getting doubled isn't actually that big a deal. He's so bulky he survives it most of the time anyways, but it just gives a really bad impression.
Yeah,
people hate to see a unit.
That is what I'm getting to, is getting doubled feels bad. It reminds me of when people are complaining about a unit getting weighed down by weapons, even though those units are still fast enough to double, or at least not get doubled when using something like a blade weapon. That's definitely what it reminds me of. And even though the numbers that you're getting doubled by are not that big, it doesn't feel bad. I guess it just feels bad to get attacked twice, I guess. But in a way, I feel like this might almost help Alfred in some cases, even if he gets more meter out of it. I think that'd be hilarious if he can make use of that.
He gets more meter out of it. He gets a chance to crit the enemy before their second attack. He gets 2 chances to dodge or 2 chances to Golden Lotus.
Mm-hmm.
It's better in every way to get doubled rather than to get hit hard once, but it feels worse. And so a lot of people don't like that.
Mm-hmm. I guess the only nitpick is like you have an extra chance to get crits, but does he face crit rates early on? Do you remember?
Not really. His luck's pretty good, actually. It's on the higher end. Like, once steel weapons start showing up, those have an innate 5 crit, which can be an issue. But that's not until around, like, Chapter 9 and onwards that steel weapons become common. So that's not going to be an early game issue, and by then he should not be getting doubled because you have more tools. I think a lot of people miss how easy it is to not get doubled and engaged no matter how slow you are, because you have just so many options to boost speed.
You mean like cooking and
like
emblems?
Cooking. Yeah, or the emblems. And then stuff like eventually you get Byleth, which can give you rally speed or rally spectrum. Eventually you start being able to buy speed from Lyn. Eventually you get more reclass options. And so you can always pump up a unit's speed as needed to avoid getting doubled. So once you get past the very early game, he'll basically never get doubled again. And like I said, him getting doubled in the early game is more a benefit than it is a harm. Like, obviously, it'd be better if he didn't, but if he got hit once for the same damage, it'd be worse.
For sure. So, what I'm getting from this is Alfred's early game, because if the only thing that doubles him are those sword fighters that are doing about as much damage to him as they're doing to everyone else who doesn't get doubled, then his durability early game is then pretty fine, I guess.
Yeah, it's aside from Vander, who just has such a massive HP pool that pretty much nothing can kill him. The only unit who's bulkier than him is Louis. Everyone else, he's more durable than, so he has a pretty major durability lead over most of the early game cast, even when he does get doubled sometimes.
Okay, so on durability, I guess we can't really ask for a whole lot better. Durability was not my only issue with Alfred personally. I also found that he was often short of getting kills in the early game, but that greatly depends on what you're trying to send him in to do. Obviously, he's not going to do any damage to an armor knight, so I wouldn't expect him to do that. But I remember he was like 3-shotting enemies on hard mode, and that's like, I don't know, it's kind of okay, I guess. It definitely gave me some forward feelings that he was doing that. It was like equivalent to like Etier against non-flyers or something. Do you think his offense is like middle of the road kind of thing?
It definitely could be better. He has one less strength than Etier on player phase, and then he has his personal on enemy phase, so he has one more than her on enemy phase.
If he waits,
but
yeah.
He's pretty, yeah.
It's not a guarantee.
But he's pretty, yeah, you can't always get it. Sometimes you need to attack. But like, he's got pretty comparable offense to Etier against non-flyers. But that's still, as far as physical units go, that's actually above average. It's just that physical combat in Engage has a lot of shortcomings. But as far as like physical units go, he's pretty solid. He will generally 3-shot with an Iron Lance if you give him like the Strength Tonic and you get an early Steel Lance now. I don't know if people want to consider like heroes bonuses and stuff, like the Fensilvere or the new DLC gives you a Silver Lance, but regardless of what you consider, you always get a Steel Lance from the just day 1 update, even if you don't have the DLC, and that Steel Lance changes a lot of his 3-shot ranges into 2-shot ranges, which is a pretty big deal.
That's fair. I can see that working for finishing enemies off, but does it not getting doubled by anything else? Because I remember his build is already an issue, right?
Oh yeah, it'll get him doubled. But notably, like, say against those sword fighters that would double them, if you break them on player phase, you don't get doubled, and then they attack into you on enemy phase, and then they die because you 2-shot them, so you don't get doubled there either. So there's a lot of ways that you can work around being doubled, even when you weigh yourself down with the Steel Lance. Alternatively, you can use something like an engage attack, like Sigurd's Override with the Steel Lance, to soften up a group of enemies, and then have them all attack into you, and then none of them double because they die on the counter.
Yeah, that's fair. We might as well talk about Sigurd and giving them to him, because from what I can tell from like Zoran's demonstration videos, and I think from talking with you as well, that's like his main selling point is making good use of Sigurd in chapters 4 and 5. And there was actually a video quite long ago already about Alfred using Sigurd. It was, I don't remember the username, but I'll look it up for the video. And they were like pretty staunchly defending Alfred in the context of maddening with DLC and DLC stat boosters. Like the guy basically said, okay, I'm giving Alfred the Draco Shield. And because he did that, I was like, okay, I don't really want to just give him that for free and then see how good he is. But I can definitely see how he makes good use of Sigurd. And then Zoran, I think, popularized it a little bit more by saying, okay, if you give Alfred Sigurd in chapter 4, then you can build up bond level with him, and then in chapter 5, he's like the only way you can make use of momentum. That's the main sell I've gotten from Alfred. Does that sound right?
Yeah, early game Sigurd is definitely his biggest selling point. It's funny you bring up the Draco Shield. +2 defense on Alfred, combined with the defensive bonus from Sigurd, helps him reach just a phenomenal amount of defensive benchmarks. But you don't actually have to use the Draco Shield to get that. You can use the early defense tonic that you get in, because you can buy one of every tonic early on.
Oh, right.
If you use that in chapter 5, you can meet all those same defensive benchmarks and then you can give him Sigurd, and he's just phenomenal. He basically does everything Louis does, while also having more movement, so he gets more momentum damage, and he can actually enemy phase sword fighters.
Yeah, because the idea is that if you're playing on Manning, then Louise is just not going to get attacked, especially if he has Sigurd Chapter 5, is what I've noticed as well. But Alfred probably takes like 1 or 2 damage, and then it makes it work.
Yeah.
Is that the idea?
Yeah, with the Steel Lance, he takes 2 damage twice from the sword fighters, which is pretty complete. Like, that's a negligible amount of damage, and so they'll actually attack into him, and you can just clear out all those little groups of sword fighters, while also having someone who can position to get max momentum damage.
Yeah, and Louise can't even use momentum in Chapter 5 because he joins on the field. You can't give him Sigurd in the prep ring, so there's no way to build him up to have momentum bot level, right? Because you only get the arena after Chapter 5, I think. Is that right?
You don't have the arena until your start of Chapter 6. So you can't get Louis any bond rank with Sigurd before then, so he has no access to momentum for the first couple turns, which doesn't sound like a big deal, except that Chapter 5 is sort of built around you getting that one big override in that hallway to clear out like 5 guys, and Louis just can't get momentum for that.
Yeah, I will say in Louise's defense, he can still make that override. He can make it there, even with his lower movement. In fact, I do it like turn 2 every time, but knowing that Alfred can reach the same enough defensive benchmark, you could probably do it with him instead and just be fine, right?
Yeah, and then after Alfred does it, he can enemy phase the enemies who don't die, because Louis is just going to get ignored by that archer.
Yeah, true. I think what I always did is I just took them to death slowly, and then I take the emblem pool in the chest room. But I will say Alfred's way of doing it seems a lot faster, more efficient. But yeah, I guess it's like one thing that's probably good to keep in mind is like how much of this is Alfred, putting it really bluntly, like how much of this is him saving turns or him working well in a planned playthrough versus how easy is it to make use of him casually? Like, would you actually recommend Alfred to like people new to Manning, for example, or is this a unit that can only work with like extensive meta knowledge?
So these like specific little advantages, like he's slightly better in certain places with Sigurd in the early game, is mostly something that you sort of need to plan out. But I think what you don't need to plan out that he has a massive advantage over Louis for is his long term. And I think you noticed this well. Louis just has such a hard time scaling into late game.
For sure.
He does not function. Alfred, on the other hand, while it's a little harder to see, he actually does work much better late game in just a completely different role.
Yeah, it's funny because like a lot of comments, a lot of tweets were saying he falls off, which is something people say about Louise as well.
Yeah,
but it's different, right?
And as a combat unit, I totally agree. He falls off as a combat unit. He gets to a point where you give him a bunch of effective weapons, and he like 2-shot stuff with them. At a point when you have like mages who can 1 round, and it becomes a lot less impressive. But there are a lot of other things he can do. I guess we can't really talk about Alfred without talking about Bonded Shield, which I think is like, it's the biggest and most obvious selling point. For the people who don't know, Bonded Shield is just comically overpowered. A lot of people miss this, but when it says it prevents the first attack per turn, it means the first attack from every enemy that turn.
This is Lucina's emblem ability thing, by the way, if you're wondering. You have to engage with Lucina and then use it. And I think you use it, and then anyone who's adjacent gets the Bonded Shield effect, the Bonded Shield benefits, basically. And it has a 100% proc rate on units with the same subclass. So if Alfred were a Cavalier and he uses it, any Cavalier that's adjacent gets their first attack, gets the enemy's first attack blocked, right?
Right. So if you're not getting doubled, then Bonded Shield makes you completely invulnerable to all damage except for brave weapons, which is a little absurd. And in order to maximize Bonded Shield, like you said, you need the same subclass. You need to either both be Cavs, both be Flyers, or both be Armors. Or you can use a Key Adept, But obviously there's advantages to being mounted, the extra movement and stuff. But then you also really want your bonded shield user to be bulky, because it's not going to do you any good if your bonded shield user uses bonded shield and then gets attacked and dies. But if they use it, have better defenses than the person they're using it on, the AI doesn't see bonded shield and just goes for the initial person, which makes Alfred just really well suited to spamming bonded shield in the mid game.
Because I'm assuming what you're doing is you're making Alfred the least attractive AI target, and because they don't see bonded shield, they will always go for adjacent people. So as long as those people have less defense, or I guess less resistance, depending on the enemy, they will never go for Alfred, right?
Avoid also factors in, as well as a couple other things, like they will try to like break even if it's less damage. It's the sort of thing where you just gotta learn a little bit about the AI, and you can do a lot to adjust your defensive stats and your avoid and stuff. And Alfred's a really good candidate because his Avenir class, while it isn't like as bulky as Great Knight, it has really well-rounded bulk. So with tonics and stuff, he'll never get doubled. Then it has better resistance than Great Knight, so you're also diverting mages, which a Great Knight wouldn't do, while still having enough defense that physical enemies are still going to prefer to go for like a Mage Knight or something.
Interesting. So the idea is then that you use Alfred with Sigrid a bit early game, and then I'm assuming he needs Marth at some points to get enough XP to promote or reach some kind of stat benchmarks, and then he just gets Lucina for the rest of the game. Is that the plan?
Sort of. Depending on how much you use him and how much you're planning to get, I doubt you'd actually need Marth. I know, like, when Zoran was playing around with the early game, he found that you actually have more units you can give Marth to than units who can benefit from the EXP. So it's not actually that big of an issue to give Alfred Marth for one chapter and let him just kill a bunch of stuff and get EXP. But even without that, and just giving him Sigurd, it's really not hard to get him to promotion level. Because he joins at such a low level with 300 base XP, he only needs to gain 7 levels to get Cantor before Chapter 10.
Yeah, which requires 1,000, and then he doesn't need anything else, right, from early game units to inherit.
There's a lot of really useful options to inherit, and I think one of his bigger strengths is that there are so many different options. Like, for example, since the plan is to just use him as a bulky person who can spam emblem abilities, favorite food is incredible for that.
Oh yeah.
So getting something like favorite food, but even if you don't want to do that, there's a lot of other really useful utility skills from the early emblems, stuff like Headlong Rush or Staff Mastery or something, which those are the types of things you'll probably only grab if you're in like a really planned out playthrough. But they do still exist and are options that he has that a lot of people don't.
I can totally see favorite food because, obviously you're going to run out of gauge at some point. You want to recharge it in one turn. But Staff Mastery? I gotta ask, what's the idea here?
Well, the idea is that none of the emblems in the mid-game give staff proficiency. So if you want to have a staffer, it either needs to be exactly Andreo or someone from the early game. Or one of the royals who can. But, so, picking up a bunch of proficiencies on a early game unit so that they can just reclass as you need, and maybe jump into Griffin or jump into something like, so that they can just jump around to all different classes.
Okay, so this is like, by Staff Mastery you mean like the thing that lets you reclass, right? I was confused with like actually getting a staff rank, but that's a different thing I'm thinking of.
Yeah,
right?
no, I mean the staff proficiency from Bleep. Sorry, I think the staff, it is called, the skill is called Staff Mastery.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean staff proficiency. I think you can just do a couple levels with Leaf and you get like every single proficiency. Except for like Tome or something, but obviously Alfred doesn't need Tome proficiency for anything. So Alfred then has the opportunity before Chapter 10 to inherit any proficiencies and any utility skills that no one's going to be able to get until Chapter 17.
Interesting. So that's pretty unique then. That's pretty cool. So then... sorry, go on.
Yeah, and like any other pre-chapter 10 unit can do that. But what other pre-chapter 10 unit is extremely well-rounded and bulky and has access to a lot of SP?
I'm going through all the like early game units in my head real quick. Obviously, Vander is out because his SP gain is just Garbo, right? So then you have Alir, who probably wants to do other things. I'm assuming Etier is just more of a warrior than nothing else kind of thing.
Yeah, Etier is one of those units who can make like physical combat work. So I don't see why you'd put her into a utility role, especially one that requires bulk because she does not have bulk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, actually, this might be a good time to jump into like a bit of a gauging of like how good is Alfred actually, then kind of thing, right? So
Yeah.
we're not trying to say that Alfred is the best thing since sliced bread. So just for comparison, we're not saying he's as good as Chloe or Ivy or Kagetsu or something, right? Like he's at least a tier worse than those, right?
Absolutely. Probably even 2 tiers worse than those units, because those are like the 3 best units in the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to compare to them.
Okay, so how would you compare Alfred to someone like Alchrist, for example?
He's definitely better than Elchrist. Elchrist has a lot of issues,
Mm-hmm.
which, and most of all, is Alchrist SP gain. Alchrist has a level 10 unit, has 500 SP. So in order to get Alchrist something like Canner before Chapter 10, he basically needs to staff grind with Micaiah. Whereas Alfred has none of those issues, and that is an easy niche to slot into. So I think he's easily better than a lot of the... Brodia gives you a lot of really underwhelming units who are in this massive SP hole. And I think this is a good time to bring up the Well, actually. A lot of those tweets were mentioning how the Well fixes Alfred. I think it's actually the opposite. I think the Well hurts him more than helps him.
I was about to say, this is going to help him a lot if we're comparing him to, say, Amber, right? Who is considered to be very similar in class and everything.
I think they're a lot more different than people give them credit. But the Well hurts him. Like I said, his main advantage is he has a really low starting level with pretty normal SP for that level, and so he can gain a lot of SP throughout the early game. Especially because he's so potent with Sigrid, he can just eat up EXP. But now that the Well's out, it's hard to compare that to someone like Jade, who before people wrote off Jade because, well, it's impossible to get her Canter without saving a paralog for her. And so that was a pretty big flaw that she no longer has. So I think the Well actually sort of makes Alfred's niche a little less special, but it doesn't change the fact that, like, this still works.
Yeah, I've heard, I think Soren said, sure, you don't need the Well, or rather the Well makes it easier to fix units that really need the SP very badly before Chapter 10. But at the same time, now you can use those SP books you get for bigger skill benefits. Like you can take things that cost a lot of SP a lot easier, like, I don't know, Speed Taker or Strength plus whatever you want, right? So instead of, barely have enough SP to scrape by to get Canter, now you have access to much better skills if you save that amount of SP. So the difference in the speed between Alfred and other units hasn't exactly increased or decreased, but rather the amount of options that you have with SP has increased, it feels like. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. And so the fact that the Well exists now is you can look at it as the fact that Alfred doesn't need the Well to get a sufficient amount of SP means you can use your Well SP on other people.
Mm-hmm. He's like a little Jagan with higher SP. It's a higher base level. He doesn't steal XP like other people.
Yeah, he's like a Jagan who doesn't steal EXP, because even though Alfred's stats aren't going to be the greatest long term, we can recycle him and turn him into a different utility unit.
So I'm assuming this puts Alfred, like, I don't even need to ask, like, he's above like all those Brodian units then, in your opinion, right? Like, I don't need to ask about, say, Amber or Diamant. Or...
I'd consider Amber and Citrine specifically better than him, but no one else from Brodia.
I see. I'm assuming, I'm interested you said, why Amber? Because he has like a doubling options, special doubling option that let him use his high strength?
Alfred's actually faster than Amber if you compare their personal speeds. So it's not about doubling. It's mostly just Amber's strength is so tremendously high that once you get Amber doubling, he does more damage.
Yeah,
It's like a
I was thinking of like
balance.
halberdier builds and stuff like that for Amber, stuff like that to make him double and then outclass Alfred in strength department.
Right, yeah. Alfred's speed is actually a little better than Amber. It's funny. It's just that Avenir is so slow that he seems slower. If you were to reclass him to Wyvern, he gets like +3 speed.
Oh, that's funny. And then Citrine, I'm assuming, is just like completely different kind of unit with options that Alfred doesn't have,
I think,
right?
yeah, I mean, Amber is also a completely different unit. Like, Alfred's really bulky and does utility jobs, whereas Amber tries to use his extremely high strength to make physical combat work. And then Citrine's just a mage, which it's hard to compare.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would you consider Alfred better than Louise, like, or Louis, whatever you pronounce it, like all around?
Yes, absolutely. I think he's better in the early game, and I think he has an easier time slotting into a late game utility role. So I think he's just better than Louis.
If you said this like day 2 when the game came out, that'd be so funny.
Yeah.
Obviously, I guess an interesting one would be like some kind of mid-game unit that's kind of there. How about Fogado? What do you think versus Alfred? Because Fogado was not around during the early game.
Yeah, I think Fogado's probably better. Fogado's got a lot of like really interesting stuff going on that's a lot more unique than what Alfred does. And so it's in a game where units are kind of as homogenized as they are. I think having unique utility is kind of interesting. And Alfred definitely does lack a little bit of uniqueness.
Yeah, the feeling I get from Fogado is that he's just like very low brain, easy to make really good, right? You just take the Radiant Bow and maybe reclass him if you want to, and then he's just good. Whereas Alfred seems to be a bit more sophisticated.
Yes, I think the easiest comparison between like a mid to late unit and Alfred is between Goldmary and Alfred.
All right.
Goldmary has a very similar stat line to Alfred of like acceptable speed, but not really good enough to double without a lot of help, and not too impressive strength, but pretty solid defense. But then she cranks the defense up to 11. And so they're very similar. And it makes it so that Goldmary's like job becomes very clear. And I think you even found this in your first run. The easiest thing to do with Goldmary is to take some emblem that you don't have any user for, but you don't want to give it up, and just give it to her and have her just carry it around as a cavalier.
Yep, you just needed someone who clicks Twin Strike every now and then. That's what she did. I think it was partially I want to bench 2 of my units. I don't know who to replace it with, and Goldmary's high level, so let's go. That was also part of it. Like I couldn't do that with Alfred if I didn't train him in the early game, obviously, but Goldmary was perfect for it.
Yeah, and so having a bulky cavalier who can just carry around a ring and use one of its overpowered abilities, like Twin Strike, or like Goddess Dance, or obviously, as we mentioned, like Bonded Shield, is really useful because they're bulky enough that enemies won't mess with them, and they're mobile enough that they can get the ring where you need it. And so even though it's not really a flashy role and it's not exciting, it is important. And I think Goldmary and Alfred sort of show that role off the best. The difference is just that Goldmary comes without any need for training, but Alfred's really good and exists for the early game so it's hard to say which one's better, but they're very comparable.
I do like that comparison. I was wondering if one of them was better, because obviously Alfred has the options from the early game, like the skills inheritance we talked about, but Goldmary takes like no effort to fulfill the Lucina role. Although she's also not around for the entire Soul Mark, right? So that also kind of cuts into her utility a bit. That's like a good amount of bonded shields that Alfred can execute that Goldmary just has no answer for.
Right, yeah. So I think they're very similar. Goldmary's better when you have both, but you have Alfred for a lot longer than you have Goldmary. So I think that's about where I'd rate Alfred. Wherever you put Goldmary, I'll put Alfred right next to her.
That's interesting, because they're so different in availability and beginning class, but in the end, they make best use of their similar role. That is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a good idea now of how to use Alfred next time I play. Is there anything important that we missed discussing, Alfred, that you want to close out with?
I don't know. I think a lot of it is just people need to consider what tools they have available to them. If you see a unit's getting doubled, think about if that's a problem, and also if you can stop it. Like, there's a lot of tools that Engage gives you, and sometimes it gives them to you, and sometimes it takes them away. And I think once you start looking at what those tools can do, a unit like Alfred becomes a lot better.
All right. I'm actually kind of excited to use Alfred now. I'm actually kind of wanting to start over and play with him now that I've talked about this. Well, Septi, thank you so much for coming on. And
yeah, thank you for having me.
And if you all like the video, you know what to do. And if I post another Twitter thread on my Twitter where I'm asking about a unit, you know what's going to happen. So I might use your tweets in my videos. And yeah, a last thing I want to say here. Normally what I do if I find an interesting unit like Alfred is I make a waifu video, but experience has taught me they take a long time to produce properly, and this takes me like a little bit over half an hour of recording time, and it's honestly almost as interesting. So if you want more videos like this, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you all around. Septi, thank you for joining, and I'll see you all around.